to the Migration Research Group's seminar today. We're really delighted to welcome Dr. Mary Setrana from the University of Ghana as our speaker, and Dr. Tom Goodfellow from the University of Sheffield as the discussant. So my name is Magella Kilkey, and I'm co-director along with Annetta Pickett of the Migration Research Group. And Rebecca Murray is the Migration Research Group's manager, and so many of you will have had contact with Rebecca in setting up and getting registered for this event. So thank you everyone for coming. I will start by introducing our speakers and giving a little bit of a bio on them, and then tell you how we are going to run the session. So Mary Setrana is a really well-known migration scholar from the Centre for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. She was appointed in 2014 in that role, and when she was appointed, she was actually the first female lecturer at the Centre for Migration Studies there. So she broke a record. So congratulations, Mary, in achieving that. Mary's research interests include migration, gender and development, return migration and reintegration, transnational migration and diaspora and migration, conflict and peace building. Mary works on a number of ongoing research projects, and these include some really high-profile ones that I'm sure many colleagues know about. So one is the GCRF South-South Migration, Inequality and Development Hub, funded by UKRI. The Migration and Social Transformation Project, funded by the European Union. Culture for Sustainable and Inclusive Peace Project, funded by UKRI. And Crises as Opportunities project, funded by the European Union. Mary also has a really strong engagement with policymakers. So she's developed a Ghana National Academic Diaspora Intervention Roadmap, a pilot document for other African Union member states. She has participated either as a lead or co-consultant on national, regional and continental policies and capacity building projects, including developing Ghana's diaspora policy, Malawi's national labour policy, migration policies for Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe, capacity building plan on sustainable return and reintegration for Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique and South Africa. And she has participated as a migration expert trainer on the African Union's migration governance training modules for its member states. So I think it's just such a fantastic combination, Mary, this really strong kind of intellectual academic engagement alongside very practical policy orientated work. And I'm sure that will come out today in your presentation. So thank you very much for agreeing to contribute to the Migration Research Group's seminar series. We're joined today by Dr. Tom Goodfellow as discussant. So Tom is a senior lecturer in urban studies and planning at the University of Sheffield. His research focuses on the political economy of urban development and change in Africa, especially the politics of urban land and transportation, conflicts around infrastructure and housing, and urban institutional change. Tom has conducted research in Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Kenya, with a range of institutional partners in Africa, including Makerere University, Addis Ababa University, University of Lagos, and University of Witwatersrand. His current and recent research is mostly funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council and the Global Challenges Research Fund. He's also, like Mary, strongly engaged in policy work. So he's engaged in advisory work for a range of international organizations, including Oxfam, ICF International, the Frederick Ebert Foundation, DFID, now FCDO, UN Habitat, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the Swiss Development Corporation, and the governments of Rwanda and Uganda. So thank you, Tom, for joining us today and agreeing to be a discussant to Mary's paper. So we will proceed with Mary speaking first for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then Tom will offer his reflections on her presentation, and we'll give Mary an opportunity to respond to Tom's comments. Then we'll open it up to the wider audience for questions and comments. We'll collect comments, questions in the chat. So please do use the chat function. You can put things in as we go along, or wait until Mary is finished speaking. And I will collect the questions and that are put in the chat and put them to Mary and Tom as well, if any are directed at him. So in terms of virtual etiquette, just a reminder, I'm sure we're all used to it now, that your audio and camera are turned off, and a note that the seminar is being recorded. A reminder too to please tweet and tag at Sheffield MRG for those of you who are on Twitter. So I'll move on by saying welcome again to Mary, and we're really looking forward to hearing your paper, Choosing to Stay, Alternate Migration Decisions of Ghanaian Youth. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Magdala, for I don't know how to describe the introduction, but that was a very sweet one. Thank you for that. And also thank you for inviting me to this seminar series. I'm happy to be sharing one of the works I really enjoy. Maybe as a way of background to the work, I didn't set out to, it was funding from the Swedish government. I didn't set out to look at alternate decisions of Ghanaians and when it comes to migration. I rather set out to look at migration decisions of younger people. And out of that, I found something on immobility, which is one of the current discussions, although not too much. There isn't much discussions there, so I found it very interesting, and that is why this paper came out of the data I collected at the time. So as the title goes, Choosing to Stay, Alternate Migration Decisions of Ghanaian Youth. I'm also welcome to different titles. If after the presentation, I can do maybe another paper on that. Please, can I have the next slide? So as a way of outline, I'll be giving a brief introduction, some conceptual issues, why people stay, research methods, findings, and conclusion. Please, the next slide. Yeah, so by way of introduction, why immobility and what's the discourse on immobility? And so why people stay has received less attention in the migration discourse, especially those of us who have been working in this field for some time. We know that there isn't much discussions when it comes to immobility. And when we talk about even the percentages of the percentage of migrants, so despite the high proportion of immobility compared to the smaller percentage of 3.5% as a proportion of those the world's population who are internationally mobile. So although there is so much talk about people moving, it's just 3.5% of the world's population. And again, when it comes to the African context, there's so much narratives on people migrating through the irregular means and migrating outside. But again, this is also the other side of it, that there is frequent neglect of immobility and overemphasis on migration that has prompted descriptions such as age of immobility, mobility bias by Carlin and other colleagues. And so some studies have been done showing that when it comes to the sub-Saharan Africa, studies have shown that over half of adults, which is about 51%, in the sub-Saharan Africa do not desire to move to another country. And this may be surprising to a lot of us. In migration studies, theories on reasons why people migrate also leaves a gap. And so most of the theories are talking about why people move, but still there is a gap as to why people don't move. So if you take the NEL, the neoclassicals, you take the new economics of labor migration, if you take all the theories, they help us understand why people move. But the other side, which is why people stay, is not too clear in these discourses. And so this presentation, I'm looking at the challenges of migrants leading to the staying processes as well as reasons influencing their decision to stay. Please, next slide. And so I do this by looking at the discourse on conceptualizing immobility. And so it started off with earlier discussions by Massey, by De Haas, and then Carlin, and later scholars have also looked at these dynamics. But in this particular one, I looked at what Carlin's framework on aspiration and ability model. And so this is the description of it. So the pictorial picture, the picture shows that, or maybe the diagram shows that, yes, there is aspiration, there is ability. And in between aspiration, when you take aspiration, the people have the aspiration to migrate or aspiration not to migrate. So the migration aspiration could lead to voluntary non-migrants, or it could lead to involuntary non-migrants. And then there are other factors that influence these aspirations. It could be a migration fact environment, which is the context, the country, the home country context, and then the individual characteristics, whether the person, what the background characteristics of the person we are talking about. And then you move to the ability. So the ability also has two dimensions: the immigration interface, the individual level characteristics, and the migrant. And so here the ability, your ability shifts from the aspiration. So the aspiration is when you are in the process of thinking and making efforts, but the ability is when you actually have the resources, you have concretized your ideas, and you move. And so these ones are also influenced by your immigration interface. And so by immigration interface, sorry, by immigration interface, you would have jumped through all the hurdles of strict immigration policies, among others. And then individual level characteristics also influence that. So before you move to the actual migrant, you would have been involuntary non-migrant, meaning that you have the desire and aspirations to migrate, but certain factors, including the immigration factors, the immigration interface, the individual characteristics, would have prevented you from moving into the actual migrant box. And so that's the description that is given. Please, let's go to the next slide. And so in the next slide, I try to explain, maybe let me just do that quickly to give you a better understanding. And so by the model, what Carlin is saying is that a migration aspiration is defined simply as a conviction that migration is preferable to non-migration. And by aspiration is a specific type of attitude, a subjective evaluation of an object or concept, which in this case is migration. And then by migration aspirations, they are the social norms and expectation about migrating or staying, opportunities for migration, and the structural forces facilitating or constraining particular migration trajectories. Sorry. And then ability, the element that symbolizes whether potential migrants can turn their migration aspirations into actual migration. Then we have the actual migrants, those who aspire to migrate and have the ability to do so. And then in that, so there is also the involuntary non-migrant, which you saw in the diagram, which is the migration having migration aspiration, but may lack the ability to do so. The next slide. And so that explains some of the concepts that were used in the earlier diagram. And so here, looking at the theory and also from my own understanding and assumptions, I feel that the framework leaves some questions to be answered. So what is next for people within the involuntary immobility? So those who have the desire, but according to the theory, the conceptual framework, they've been hindered by several factors. And whether they remain involuntary immobile for the rest of their lives, or decide to move from being involuntary immobile to voluntary immobile if they cannot move into the actual migrant box. At what point do they engage in such decisions, and what processes shape such decisions and why? And so as a point of departure, this article or in this presentation, I operationalize ability as element that represents whether potential migrants would turn and channel their migration aspirations into a non-migration decision. And so yes, they are in between the aspiration and ability, but how do they transition? So I try to use this piece to show how they transition from being in mobility and crossing over to the mobility side. And then here, although they use ability, Colin uses ability, and also the has and Master use ability, or even Sen, look at the resources they have, moving them to the actual migration. I am trying to use it to say that they move into the other direction, which is the immobility part. And so the ability is an opportunity for the involuntary immobile person to exercise his or her agency to move into the category of voluntary immobility. And so here, agency is used to refer to individuals' ability to exercise their own free will and make their own choices to stay voluntarily. And so please, the next slide. And so here the discussion is that yes, people stay. It's not that regular assumption that people are staying because they don't have money, because there are restrictions, but beyond these discussions, do people necessarily or on their own make decisions to stay? And so why do people stay? So there are some factors from the literature that explain why people stay. And so the immobility influence decisions are influenced by are categorized into different factors. So we have retain, repel, and internal constraints. So quickly, when we talk about the retain factors, we are talking about favorable conditions that encourage staying at home. And here we can have the economic factors and we can have the non-economic factors. So the economic factors are derived from the rational choice theory. And so we have the rational choice theory and we have the location-specific advantages which are accumulated over time. And so by rational choice theory, it stipulates that people will prefer staying if the cost of migrating offsets the benefits of staying. Again, when it comes to the location-specific advantages, this one highlights that when people have insider advantage due to consistent location and relationship with a place, the likelihood of them staying is also high. And so among the non-economic factors, so the ones I've explained as economic, the non-economic factors also include the voice, loyalty, religion, family, community ties, which also enable people to stay. Please, the next slide. So the next one is repel factors. When we talk about repel factors, we are looking at conditions elsewhere that diminish the aspiration to migrate. And here some of them include job opportunities in potential destination and financial cost of migration. And some of the non-economic factors also include stress of leaving home, dangers of the journey, xenophobia, and racism. And there are also internal constraints. Here is more nuanced influences on decision making at the level of individual psychology that attempt to explain why people may not meaningfully consider alternatives to staying. And so when we talk about internal constraints on decision making, it cuts across the threshold of indifference, lacking achievement motivation, an underdeveloped capacity to aspire, and risk aversion. Please, the next slide. Yeah, so what's the context? So those are the literature context. So what's the context of Ghana when it comes to migration? And so yes, Ghana has a long history of migration, population immobility. And so it's very dynamic when it comes to migration patterns, very complex also. And it has been so since pre-colonial time till now. And so migration has always played a central role in the livelihood and advancement strategies of both urban and rural populations. And so there are also distinct phases when it comes to Ghana's migration history. We have the net emigration, when Ghana used to receive a lot of immigrants, and later when a lot of people were leaving Ghana due to the economic problems and political challenges. However, recent times, the general economic conditions for doing business and also Ghana moving to a middle income country, discovering oil, has also changed some of the dynamics. And so people are also deciding to stay and even return home due to these other factors in the country. Please, the next slide. So beyond what I have just presented, what methods did I use? As I said, I set out to look at decisions of young people, aspirations. At what point do they start nurturing the migration intentions? And so out of the data, I had 7 participants, and these included potential migrants who were unsuccessful in their attempts to migrate to Europe or North America, but currently have little to no aspiration, desire, or dream to migrate to Europe or North America. And so while I was on the field, I was actually going to do just exploratory study to find out what questions I should ask. And then I found that a lot of these young people had embodied, as soon as you ask them, I don't want to migrate, but then upon second discussion and further deliberations, I felt that or I got to know that they had rather given up on migration. They didn't want to go. It's not as if they had not attempted before. They had, but they had decided not to do it again. And so I was wondering, at what point do people give up on it? That to the extent that even when you show them the visa with free, all the things that are free, they are still not interested in it. And so through snowballing, looking at the sensitive nature and also the nature of the study, then I had to rely on these net people that I identified first, and also a gatekeeper who lived in the community, to also through snowball to identify other people. And so these are the categories I found. So 4 of the participants had made 2 failed attempts, and all the other 3 had also made 1 to Europe and to North America. And so the challenge here was that when it came to identifying females who had participated in such experiences, it was difficult to find. One, you find and they don't want to talk, but it's also most of them also went through they went to the Middle East, which I was not interested in that. But I found also that some of them who went to the Middle East also proceeded to other places because their final destination was not the Middle East. Also, I only had a few women, but that was also a difficulty. And so there was some thematic analysis based on migration decisions, attempts, and the failed attempts. Please, the next slide. So again, so there were some in-depth. So here I used the life history approach, and by the life history approach, not the entire life, but looking at the entire life, focusing on migration aspirations. So when you were young, what time did you start nurturing that? Was it a friend? And so that's although it's a life history, just focused on the sections that deal with migration. And so I also wanted to understand the in-depth knowledge or in-depth insights into why people make certain decisions and at what point. So what I can say is that the in-depth nature of the interviews also contributes to the theories and the existing discussions on immobility, which are mostly either quantitative or which are also mostly abstract in nature. So I felt that this one would help us get some empirical understanding into what exists in the literature. But again, I can say that to replicate the study, yes, it can be done, but the contextual factors are very, very important, especially in a context where migration is a culture. Everybody wants to migrate. It's not easy to take that decision. And so, yes, it can be replicated, but the context must be taken into consideration. And so all the ethical considerations were made. Interviews were done at the location of the people. It was done in Twi and translated into English. Consent was sought, and I'm using pseudonyms, not the real names also. Please, let's move on to the next slide. Yes, so the profile, I had 7 people. Out of that, 2 were females, and their educational status at the time of the interview was junior secondary certificates, mainly, then primary certificates. I think that's why you call it a high school in other places. Then somebody had graduate certificate, and another had no formal education. The jobs they were doing was trading, catering service, business consultants, among others. So the age as at the time of, this is the current age, but in my paper, I also calculate the current, the age at which they started the journey. And most of them, looking at the age, were either 20, 16, very youthful age. But as at the time the data was being collected, there was 38, 43, 32, 45, 38, 43, 22. Please, let's move on to the next slide. And so maybe one of the things I should say is that looking at the nature of the data also meant that I had to use somebody who was familiar with the context. And so the person led me into, I mentioned that, but we needed to gain trust over time. We needed to assure them that the data was not going to use for any other thing than academic purposes and also for policy making. And so what are some of the findings? So migration processes and decisions. I begin with the story of one guy called Kidi, who at the age of 16, now he's beyond 16, at the age of 16, migrated from his village in the northern zone of Ghana to a suburb in Accra to pursue his migration to Europe dream. On his arrival, he contacted and settled with his elder sister. Accra was a transit location for him to earn income for his journey. as well as find agents who could assist him move to Agadez in Libya. And so this person was living in a very rural area, and then based on the experiences he was having around him, decided to come to Accra, which has the international airport, where hopefully he would find people to help him migrate out of Ghana. And so this was between 1997 and 2008. He worked um, worked tirelessly and saved enough money to self-finance a trip. And so his decision to migrate was in part influenced by the display of wealth by returnees from Nigeria. He stated that I made up my mind to migrate when I saw people who returned from Nigeria display loss of wealth. So when you look at the Ghanaian history, in the 1980s, Ghanaians who migrated to Nigeria came back with a lot of goodies at some point. And so Nigeria's economic crisis rather was the one that drove people away when they had to expel some Ghanaians into the country. Even that not all of them came, some also went to Libya for other benefits. And so to him, this was what inspired him to also migrate outside. Please, the next slide. And so in his own words, he said that also for those young guys from my village, so where he used to live, the rural community who migrated to Libya, they moved on to Italy, while others who moved to Morocco continued. So when there was a Nigerian crisis, that's what he's trying to explain, that people moved to different places instead of coming back to Ghana. And so migration to Europe through Libya became a necessary competition in my village, since almost every household had a migrant living in these places. I didn't have any family member abroad, and so I decided to initiate this process myself on behalf of my family. So you see, he's doing that not for him, but the fact that there is nobody in the family who has migrated, he felt that as a guy in the family, he could take that responsibility. But I had no money at that time. So one of my friends from my village who has successfully landed in Italy contacted me after his arrival to give me information on his experience through the desert to Libya. He knew I was also planning to migrate to Europe. He gave me the contact details of the agent who assisted him to also aid me in my process. So he asked me to find a minimum of $400, and this was some years back. So that was a lot of money, which is the boat fee from Agadez to Italy. Please, the next slide. And so this is how he was motivated to have that's how he had the migration desire to move from his village into Accra. And so there's another female who was rather sponsored by his father, who was wealthy, and felt that one of the inheritance he could leave for his children was to send the first daughter abroad, and so that when she had made it, she could come and take care of the rest of her siblings. And so she said that after my high school education, my father hired a connection man to assist me migrate. So when we talk about connection man, these are the people, they are like agents who facilitate migration outside the country. And we use man because usually they are men, and usually the people they recruit are female. These are gendered issues that we usually discuss when we do the research. So migrate to UK or elsewhere, to Europe or North America. So the whole process was sponsored by my dad. Because I knew I'll be migrating abroad, I didn't pursue any further education, but was waiting for the chance to fulfill my migration dream. My father thought that the best security he could give me was to send me out of the country. Please, the next slide. And so when you check the 7 people, both the male and female, the males usually had to do a stepwise migration and raise funds. But the females, one of them went through the Middle East. So she applied to as a labor migrant or domestic worker, and then had opportunity with the family she was employed to, went to Germany, and then it was that place she escaped from the hotel, and that's how she ended up in Germany. And so this other person, this female, was rather sponsored by the dad, but the men, they all said that they had to move to an urban center, work a while, have some money before they found somebody to assist them. And so the most preferred destination among these people were the UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, US, Canada, and some countries were described as transit countries, or what they describe as stepping stone to the actual preferred destination. And so here it included Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, South Africa, Benin, Saudi Arabia. And all of them, as I indicated, were depending on connection men, some their associations, friends, and family. And so in their youthful ages, migration was perceived as the only means to an end without thinking about any other. The path to a successful life could only be imagined through the lens of migration. And so here there were some gender difference, which I have explained as to why when they were raising the funds. Please, the next slide. Okay, so these are also stories, so don't be bothered about the length of it. So at the age of 21, after his senior high school, this is one of the participants, attempted to migrate to the US through Canada and Mexico through occasion. I think I have missed the title of this, but it will show up in the next one. And so this is, in this section, I showed the failed experiences of one of the potential migrants. So he says that in 2012, my relative who lived in America connected me to his friend. And so the due for the visa, which came because he wanted to migrate, he had come into Accra, he was trying to make money. And then lo and behold, his friend connects him to another friend who is in Canada. And so here they call it the due through the interviews. They will say, yes, the due, meaning that the connection to migrate to another destination country, this time was in South Africa, but it was to Canada. So the agent processing the documents directed me to submit my passports to the Canada High Commission in South Africa. And so here when I asked why not in Ghana, because the connection, the way to move out was in South Africa and not Ghana. And so they were looking out for destination anywhere, any transit country that had opportunity. So Ghana, yes, the High Commission was here, but it didn't have the opportunity. But the opportunity was in South Africa because that is where the person who was helping was. And so he says that he didn't know that I didn't know that I was expected to have a visa for South Africa to demonstrate that I was indeed in the country of where the visa was supposed to be issued. And so the journey to South Africa, he says it was through illegal means. So there wasn't any stamp in his passport. And so that became a bit of a problem. But even after that, he still had the visa. And so he says he had 3 months tourist visa. The challenge afterwards was how to get on board with my passport without any South African stamp, but with a Canadian visa from South Africa. And so these things have changed with time. And so he said that yes, he had the visa. Now he had come to Ghana, but he had to move out of Ghana. But the problem is that he was afraid he may meet one flight attendant who is so strict that he wouldn't understand why you are in Ghana and you had a visa from somewhere. So on 3 occasions, I didn't board the plane because I had a strict flight attendant. I was scared. On all the 3 occasions, I did change my flight and paid the penalty of $100. The process repeated itself until the visa expired. And so for 3 months, he was paying $100 just because he didn't find the right atmosphere or the accommodating flight attendant to help him be on board. And so after that, he didn't give up. There was also a connection to Mexico. And so he says the next connection was to have a Mexican visa. Here, the destination was America, but it was through Mexico. And so I made a commitment fee of $400. I traveled to Abuja with 7 other guys for this connection. The Ghana agent handed us over to so here the intermediaries were located at different places. So this time, Ghana and Abuja. So they went there, but they had already paid a deposit of $400 to the Ghana agent. And so they moved on to Nigeria. And so he says that in addition to the $400 commitment fee, we also paid $500 as visa fees, making a total of $900. Now we got the deal, we have the visa. And so he says the deal, as we got to know, was that each person was supposed to pay $1,500 for visa, which the agent didn't inform us. So he got there and the Nigerian guy said, yes, now you have the visa, but you have to pay this amount. And they were expecting that the agent in Ghana would transfer at least the $400, but that didn't happen. And so he says that after 4 weeks of being stranded in Nigeria, we returned to Ghana, but without our passports. I further mobilized the remaining $1,000 to be paid to the Nigerian agent. Unfortunately, instead of giving it to the Nigerian agent straight away, he rather gave it to the Ghana agent. And so he says, but the agent squandered the money. Up until now, I never received my passport from Nigeria. Please, the next slide. And so he narrates these kinds of experiences that he had to go through. And based on these experiences, what he says is that, yes, he has wasted his money. He has spent so much, and about 300 $1,000 was already gone out of all these. And so that was where he started thinking if this was a worth investment. And so the other findings, choosing to stay is about choosing not to begin the whole process again. And so here, the story that I just ended, he said, after all those frustrations since 2013, I have given up on all my migration decisions. I felt I have wasted so much time and resources, all in the attempt to go to North America. Shockingly, in recent times when I need those offers no more, I have been receiving invitations to migrate for all kinds of reasons, including work. But I have given up. Recently, a friend of mine abroad said his company in UK needed to recruit workers. He asked if I was interested, but I refused. He sent me an invitation letter, but I explained to him that I had businesses to take care of in Ghana that needed my attention. He later asked if I could recommend someone. My cousin is now working in the UK. The invitation was genuine. He paid for nothing and no bank statements, among others. With some few days, the visa was ready, no struggle. So here, choosing to stay, as they kept, when you ask them, why did you choose to stay? Then they say, we didn't want to begin the whole process again. And so that is what they mean, not beginning the whole process again. And so at this point, they appreciated the need to find alternatives to their migration decisions. So even when opportunities of migration were presented to them, they were still not interested. And this is what ran through the various participants. Please, the next slide. So here, the other example also is from Kidi, whose story I shared earlier. He says, at first, we all wanted to go abroad, but now I have lost interest in migrating to Europe or North America. I can't go and start life all over again there. And as to the type of work I will be offered, even if I manage to go now, I have no idea. I might even wash dishes at a restaurant, but I won't do that in Ghana. Perhaps if one is unemployed, that person can afford to travel abroad and make a living. But if that person has a purposeful agenda or business in Ghana, then he or she has no business living. Even if the income is less than $50 or $100, it is sustainable. There is no need to worry and struggle to Europe or North America. For what purpose? And again, there is another Raouf who also says that when you travel and things don't go well, you lose interest. That is how I felt. My passport has expired, but since I have lost interest, I am not thinking of renewal. I won't bother myself to travel because I don't really have that time to start the process again. I am not desperate anymore. I have had a lot of opportunities since my return. There is Dubai, other places, but I don't want to waste my hard-earned money and go back and come to square zero. And so Raouf, whose story is in the article published, went to Equatorial Guinea through his friends and his association, and then he was deported. So when he came back, but he sold all his properties and businesses before leaving, and so that is why he's saying this particular statement. Please, let's move to the next slide. We are almost through. Okay, so now staying home as a preferred choice. So I used the story of one of the ladies, Akos, who feels she has control over her life in Ghana compared to living abroad. And so she says that my brother, who is in South, okay, I'm sure the UK people have helped me, who is in the UK, for instance, told me that his monthly salary is £1,400. He pays £250 for accommodation. He sometimes spends less than £100 on food. At least he's able to save about £900 every month. In Ghana, if one is not a politician or doing any better job, it is difficult to save. With all my years of working, I have not been able to even save $280 per month. One advantage is that I run my own business, employing more than 5 workers. So even if I am not at work, the job still progresses. Unlike my brother, who goes to work at 6 a.m. and closes at 5:30 p.m. By the time he closes from work, he's tired and has to retire to bed, and routine continues the next day. And so here, she admits that yes, the pay is good over there, but not here. But she thinks that the fact that she has her freedom is enough reason for her to stay here. Please, the next slide. Okay, so putting all these ideas together and trying to go back to the initial intention for the work, I hope that the presentation has been able to demonstrate that the failed attempts by potential migrants, their frustration, wasted resources, the years with the intention to fulfill their migration dreams in Europe, And so these are the things I have explored through the presentation I just did. And so their decision to stay is prefaced by the frustrated migration processes, mistrust, wasted time, money, personal energy, and later solidified by job opportunities. Positive evaluation with diaspora links, the relatively comfortable life than before, marital life, age, children, and other dependents are some of the things that inform their decision to stay. And so other key findings include the risk taken when participants were much younger. And so much of them, the decisions to migrate and all the youthful exuberance were during their much younger ages. But they feel they are also freer. Now they are older, they are freer. They felt they could try different opportunities no matter how risky at that time when they didn't have any dependence on them. But this is not the same now. Although the initial migration was taken based on narratives and perceptions of there being no future and no alternative, it turns out that there are alternatives for these participants finally. Please, the next slide. And that's the last slide. So over time, people who remain in their home country, so for instance, Ghana, find alternative immobility goals to migration. They move from the stage of involuntary staying to a voluntary staying, a process which is not captured in the aspiration ability model. Unfortunately, not all the youth express excitement about their economic situation in Ghana. Although they had chosen to stay, they hope their situation will still improve. And for these young Ghanaians, it is not a simple matter of categorizing them into involuntary and voluntary. Again, the presentation also concludes, which is also in the article, that ability and agency are significant determinants in staying process. So choosing to stay is an ability that demands the exercising of agency, which has to be negotiated by the Ghanaian youth over a period of time in a context where migration is a culture and the goal of many other youth. Please, the next slide. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mary. Really interesting presentation, and the emphasis on risk and the risks that people experience in the migration process really salient today, especially following the terrible tragedy last night, yesterday in the English Channel. So thank you for that. I'll pass over to Tom as discussant. Tom, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just, I got cut off. I got cut off in the middle there, so I had to rejoin. Thank you so much, Mary, for that paper. I'll try to be brief as we want to have plenty of time for questions. And I should also just say, well, thanks to Magella for the introduction. You mentioned many things that I've forgotten I'd ever done. And one thing I haven't done really is research in Ghana. So I should preface to say I'm no expert on Ghana or really on international migration, but I do have an interest in it and have some research projects for the future, hopefully going in that direction. And it's great to be engaging with Mary, who's also done a lot of, as I have, comparative research across different parts of Africa. Such a rich paper with many things to discuss. So I'll just highlight a few things that I found particularly interesting, a few questions for Mary, but also just some comments. I found it particularly interesting to hear about migration from a country that is not in political crisis, as you say in the paper, you know, it's had strong economic growth and is not considered a country that people are kind of needing to escape from in the way that, you know, much of the literature I've been reading has been around sort of forms of forced migration. And you know, there was a question for me of like, why wouldn't people want to stay? Because as you say, in many ways, Ghana is not a place that people have strong reasons to leave, and often the interviewees that you speak to have come to that decision themselves a bit later on. So I thought that was kind of really interesting, and I found particularly fascinating the way, in a sense, there was a sort of subversion of the myth of the American dream in a way, when people were talking about America specifically. This idea that by going to America, they would actually be sacrificing some freedom. They might earn more money there, that they could send back, but they would be less free. And I found that emphasis on freedom very interesting, particularly in terms of how America kind of sells itself as this country of great freedom. I also, because I'm no migration scholar or migration studies expert, looking at immobility for me was really refreshing, as I haven't read a lot about this, and looking at these models like the retain and repel, as opposed to the old kind of push and pull that people talk about traditionally in migration research. But there were some things that I thought were interesting in terms of thinking about that line between the voluntary and involuntary immobility. Because obviously most of your stories are about people who have tried to migrate and failed in some way, not been able to. And I thought, these stories, it really brings to the surface the challenges that people face, including in these intermediary countries, which was very interesting. I didn't know that people would literally be at the point of getting onto planes and then having to turn back again and again. And it was also interesting to see this huge range of intermediary countries, from Mexico to Saudi Arabia to other parts of Africa. So it was really interesting. But a few things I wanted to know more about, just in terms of questions, were I was quite interested in this idea of a culture of migration, and among which kind of social class or social milieu that exists, because presumably it's not the case for all Ghanaians. And perhaps it's never really seen as an option for them, or they don't have those same aspirations for some reason or another. So I was quite interested to know a bit more about the social context, maybe the social class context, where that culture of migration exists, and whether it really is everybody, or if it's confined to certain kinds of, I'm not sure, perhaps urban dwelling Ghanaians of a certain income. I also find it really interesting, that attention to the link with diaspora in the countries in Europe or America seem to cut both ways. So in some cases, getting these stories from the diaspora in Europe or America was a kind of pull factor for people to migrate. But in other cases, it was one of these repel factors, because they would hear stories from people in those countries that would put them off migrating. So the kinds of links that people have and the stories that they would get from diaspora seem to have quite contradictory effects, which was very interesting. But on this question of the kind of voluntary or involuntary nature of immobility, and the idea of choosing to stay, the fact that some people would sort of resist this culture of migration and decide to stay, I wondered, in a way, why you didn't interview some people who'd never attempted to migrate, who were fully voluntarily immobile, if you see what I mean. Because within your set of interviewees, I think they were all people who had attempted to migrate and sort of given up on it, which in a sense is a bit different from deciding from the beginning that they just didn't want to. So it would be interesting to know if you did speak to, or tried to speak to, people about their decision to stay without even really having tried to migrate. I thought that the gender dimensions were very interesting, and it would be interesting to hear a bit more about that. So in the case of the woman whose father was funding this attempted migration, and sort of pushing for it in a way, and she talks about how she would stop her education in order to do this. I thought that was really interesting, because what does it suggest about what she was planning to do on arriving? So sacrificing in a way the development of skills and education would obviously have an effect on job prospects or whatever in the host country. So I wanted to know a bit more about the rationale there. Is it sometimes the case that women are migrating not necessarily expecting to find particular kinds of work? Is there anything around marriage or other aspects of that gendered element that could be unpicked a bit more? The other thing that I found interesting and just thought it would be good to hear a bit more about is in relation to what I was saying about the different stories that people would get from diaspora, and how sometimes they would repel people from wanting to migrate rather than act as a pull factor. It's quite striking when you talked about the person who said, I would end up washing dishes and I would have, a miserable job in a way once I ended up there. I wonder if that's also changed perhaps over time, if job prospects in Europe or America are becoming worse over time for Ghanaian migrants, and if that also has led to more people choosing to stay rather than to migrate. I think that covers most of the things I wanted to talk about. I'm sure lots of other people have questions, so I won't say much more, but yeah, I really enjoyed the paper. There's lots of rich material, and thank you very much for the presentation.
Thanks, Tom, for those really thoughtful comments. There's plenty there for Mary to pick up on, as well as plenty of ideas for the conversation for the wider audience. And before Mary comes back, just a reminder to colleagues in the room to please put questions, comments in the chat box, and we'll collate them. But first to Mary for your response to Tom's comments.
Yes. Tom, thank you so much. I'm so excited about you reading the comments and the paper and the comments you have given me so far. Okay, please, can you hear me? I guess I can be heard. Yeah, so listening to your comments, I think it's even giving me more ideas. Maybe I need to go back to the field for more data collection, or maybe change the location of the data collection. Maybe I can have some ideas, especially on the question you're asking about people who have never tried it. And so let me see. I went to a community where the issue discussion is that these are young people who want to migrate. And so even the youngest, who was just in primary school, was still thinking about migration. And you ask, when did you start nurturing that? And then they refer you to a friend who left maybe when they were in grade 2 from their class to the US. And since then, they have also wanted, because the person gives them information. And so looking at the total, the people who have never tried, I think that's an interesting one. I didn't come across that, but that's something that I can also look at. But there has been other studies where we have also compared non-migrants with migrants, people who don't necessarily have the intention to migrate. And there are other reasons why people don't want to do all these things. But a total not migration, because even when they finish explaining, that what they say is that yes, at least we wouldn't mind to have a feel, we wouldn't mind to have the experience. But I think that is something that I can also pay attention to, although that was not the initial intention for this one. But coming back to the diaspora one, where you said it's looking at a pull aspect where they repel aspect. So there is a common theme that we have over years of studying migration in some communities. We come up, they usually say that the migrants usually say that it's about your destiny. And so your destiny determines whether you do well or you not do well. Your destiny determines whether you die during the journey through the desert or not. And so they think that these things are linked to your God-given life, your destiny. And so it doesn't matter the stories you tell them. That is what they say. So they will tell you that, oh, it doesn't matter, we'll go and try it. Maybe it was your bad luck, we may have good luck. And so in other studies, we have also looked at the relationship between religion and people going on such journeys, especially regular routes, where they have their spiritual persons or pastors or maybe spiritual leaders also backing them in prayer. They offer sacrifices for them because they are supporting them to go through the journey. And so yes, there is that discussion about whether, if your experience was bad, maybe that was for you. So these people, for instance, so if the example of Joe, where he got opportunity, he told the brother, yes, he would have told the brother all the stories, but the brother is still willing to go. And actually, one of the emotional times I had was on the field. I came across this guy who had just been deported. I met him the day after his deportation. And so that was a very good interview for me, but he told me not to record. So what I had to do was to listen and write later. And when I asked him, how did he experience it? How was it? Does he want to go back? Actually, the day he was talking to me, he said that he was making efforts to go the next day or the following week. He didn't mind that he had been deported. I asked, did people know he had been deported? He said yes, but everybody is saying, don't worry. And then he's a tailor, and he was expecting that. So I was asking him, people are willing to finance his trip outside. Won't the same people give him money to invest in his business? He says no. When he needs money for business, nobody minds him. But he needs money to travel, everybody is responsible. Even people, including people he's not friends with. And so that's the dynamics in the community, that it doesn't matter the worst experience, they feel that it's destiny. And as a man, you need to try it several times before you can give up. If you give up too easily, that is also not good. That is why they will try more than the times they have. And then so I mean, that brings about the discussion on the culture of migration. So when you go to, so this particular one was Accra, that's the capital of Ghana, and then it was an urban area. But there are some portions, and why I chose this one was because most of the migration to Europe studies have been done outskirts, and so usually within, not in Accra, but in other of the regions, and usually in not as urban as Accra. And then we find that people move through the irregular means outside. So I just wanted to try the Accra version. And trying the Accra urban version is just that they know the right channels to use. That's the difference from other studies we've done. They know the right channels, although initially some of them, if you listen to the discussions, they didn't know. But as at the time of the interview, they had gone through the processes, they knew the challenges, and had come out with a strategy that, yes, we will go through the regular means, but whatever the regular means is, they don't mind. If either paying more money, either transiting through somewhere. This, compared to other places, is not like that. Other places, they think that the route is the irregular way. But this one, what I found different was that they were informed, and they were making informed decisions by going through the rights or the connection man, even though it's also sometimes embedded in smuggling and trafficking. And then the question about the choosing, I think I'm sure I've answered some of them in between. I think you asked about the gender dynamics and how you said you wanted to know more about, and actually, so for instance, one of the ladies, so that was so the discussion was, how far have you come? So she ends up being a trader now, because she abandoned the migration, the educational dream. And so I asked what she wanted to go and do there. So she felt that once she gets there, so they have information that when they go, they will do all sorts of cleaning jobs. Even if you have education, you still need to start off with some cleaning and menial jobs, which that is what they are informed with. And so she thinks that if she had opportunity to go there, she would then better her education afterwards, because some of them have also educated themselves, some of them have made improvements when they travel outside. So her decision was that when she gets there, she would rather find a way of upgrading herself, or when she gets money, she comes back to establish herself. And so she nurtured that dream for so many years, and she ended up not going to school again, ended up marrying, and ended up giving birth to kids, and now she's just ended up as a trader. And so I don't know if please, if I left anything, you can, but these are the highlights of the questions. I think there was a question on the social class context. I'm not sure if my question over. So I've done other studies where I was looking at social sciences, and in that study, what I was saying was that the diaspora. So one of the things they told me is that once the diaspora meets, they speak all kinds of languages. So when they come back to Ghana for visits, some speak German, some speak Italian, and all those things are things that influence them. So they form a class. And so one of them said that class, he was responsible for washing their cars, and anytime he goes to their cars, he finds things that are from abroad and all that. And so those things were the things that pushed him to think of moving outside. And so once he gets that contact, they know that once they're able to migrate, they also can find themselves in that niche. But if you remember the story of the kiddie guy, in his village, he didn't have anybody. And so he wanted to be the sacrificial lamb for his family, which it never happened for him. That's because everybody was migrating. And actually there's a saying here that when there's a party, funeral, wedding, people wait for the diaspora to come. So you are waiting for everybody's, we are able to distinguish between families with migrants and families without migrants. And then we're able to distinguish migrants from Europe, North America, from Asia. We're able to make all those distinction based on the kind of ceremony you have. And so that's how embedded these things are in the culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for your comments, and Mary for your response. A reminder to the audience that you can put a question in the chat, or if you want to ask your question directly, you can just raise your hand, and we'll call you. While we're waiting for some questions to appear, I wanted to ask you, Mary, about your particular method. So you use life history interviews, and I'm wondering, for me, that life history really facilitates a life course lens, a life course perspective. And usually, often migration is researched as a kind of one-off event, and not put in the wider context of someone's life. We have very little longitudinal research, for example, in migration studies, and likewise, not a lot of it takes this life course, this life history approach. So I was wondering, what do we gain, from that life history method, and what do we gain by kind of shining a light on life course? And in some ways, what I was thinking was that, what your work seems to be showing kind of contradicts some other work. So I was wondering, are we seeing out of your data something around migration being more common at a particular stage of the life course? So, because some of the people you interviewed were about 40, 39, 40, so they're not youngsters anymore. So, there's been a challenge to the notion in migration studies that migration is only for young people, and I myself do work on older people in migration. But is there something about it being a particular stage of the life, and then also bringing the notion of life course in to explaining that transition to voluntary immobility? So, your data was pointing at people just being fed up at wasting their money. But do they stop wanting to migrate when they feel they need to be moving on to the next stage of their life, whatever that kind of normative construction of life course is? So, settling down, having a family, really getting a job, stop migrating because that's something you do earlier in your life. So I was just curious of what your reflections are on that life course perspective and what your data kind of suggest.
Yeah, thank you very much, Majala. I think that's a very good question to reflect on and also to speak to it. And so, so I decided to take a different approach, which usually I wouldn't have done that. Usually I would have gone with questions and then going to ask my questions and then come back. But this time around, I found it interesting that people's migration started very young, at a very young age. And so in the paper, I have age when first pursuing migration goal. And some of the ages are 24, 23, 24, 27, 25, 19. And even with Kidi, that was 16. And so these were the times when they had just started. And it tells you that they are very youthful. They had just completed a high school. They are looking for life, what life has for them. And so now they are 38, 43, 32, and they are telling me what it used to be. And so, yes, I one of the things I try to draw out is that the migration decision or the migration aspirations were very intense at the beginning stage when they were trying to figure out what life is for them. And so that is why now looking back, they feel that they had wasted money, they had wasted time, they had wasted all the things that they felt maybe could have been used for good things than it were used for. So for instance, $3,000 some years back, that was a lot of money. And he pursued this over years until 2013. That's not too far. before he decided, okay, now I think I need to take a look at this whole thing again. But it's not just at that age 24 or the 19. If you listen to the kiddie story, the thing had been nurtured right from primary school. And well, I can also trace it to what we are taught in school, the videos. Actually, one of the guys I interviewed, his story is not in this one because he hasn't made the attempt. I call him the living burger, and the burger is from the word Ghanaians who have lived elsewhere. It's a word that was from German, the burger. So people who went to Germany and came back. And so when I went there, I said I wanted to talk to a migrant. Everybody said, "Oh, talk to the Canadian burger." And I said, "Canadian burger." I just met this guy just to know that he just loves Canada but has never been to Canada. He doesn't even have a passport. He doesn't. So I asked, why Canada and of all the countries? And then he says that since he was young, and he even referred me to a program on TV that used to show Canada, Germany, and the things on. And since that time, he made it his passion to be into these countries. And I found that interesting. I watched that program, but I never had anything like I wanted to migrate. But he has nurtured it for some time now. And since he, for instance, he has not made the efforts to go anywhere, but he lives and dreams like a migrant. And he thinks like it, but he hasn't made any attempt. He doesn't have a passport. He hasn't even moved to anywhere. And so, yes, coming back to your question, I think migration is not, as we always say, not an event that happens and that is all. It's a process. That is why trying to resolve migration issues cannot just be done at a point in time when people say, let's create jobs for them, let's give them this. It's a continuous process that people have nurtured over time. And so if we want to tackle the root causes, it means that we need to start from the beginning before we can correct those challenges for them. So I do agree with you, and I think I set off with that idea of trying to see, looking at the life course, but then with particular focus, not the entire life course, which would be too much for it. I hope I have answered the question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mary. I'll come to Francis in a little minute. You've got your hand up. I just want to highlight a question in the chat from Paula Meth, who's also in urban studies and planning at the University of Sheffield. So Paula, thanks you for your interesting talk. And she wanted to ask you about your positionality and more generally the positionality of academics. So she asked, did interviewing so-called failed migrants or people who could be constructed as failed migrants, did that produce difficulties for you? In particular, because she assumes that you may have more mobility. So are migrants who haven't experienced migration in such challenging ways? I'm not sure if I've captured everything there, Paula, but the first question, the first part about your positionality.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It was difficult, especially when I met this guy who had just been deported. That's a very young guy who just came the day before, and he was sitting there just quiet, and I was just looking at him, and I wondered if this guy, it comes with shame. So he has a shame. He's ashamed of the situation. He's been deported, the stigma attached to it. But the good thing is that in that community, everybody understands. So people are ready to also support him take the next step. And so in terms of my positionality, yes, I have a lot of mobility, but even me, I always quarrel at the embassy. I always tell people the place I hate most is the embassy. I don't like going there because even with all my passport and all the things inside, I'm still asked, are you going to come back? I remember one of the times I lost my patience and told the consular, what am I going to do that? I have a permanent job. I was so frustrated that after all the visas I have, you are still asking me if when I get to the US, I'll come back. And so, yes, I also have mobility, but I also admit that there are difficulties, even the questions they ask me. Yes, my mobility is better, far, far better, in spite of all the questions sometimes I receive at the airport. And recently I was going to Maputo, and I had a note verbal from the government. I didn't have a visa. I had to take visa on arrival. And so the Ghana airport guy saw it and said, Madam, you just go. And I asked, so when I get to South Africa, how sure am I that I will be asked to enter? Then the guy said, after seeing all the visas you have, I wonder who will turn you back. And I said, really? He said, yes, that's why they are making me go, because it was in Portuguese. They didn't understand the note verbal, so they felt that I should go. And lo and behold, I got to South Africa, and the boarding pass says no entry. And I said, what? No entry? The lady said, yes, you are not allowed to enter the country. I said, what? For what reason? And they said, yes, I don't have a visa. I said, okay. Before I had to show the note verbal, they had to call the government to say that, yes, I'm allowed in before I was allowed in. So, yes, people may assume that I have mobility, but that was my difficulty. And that's not the only one. The worst of it was when I was coming and they noticed that I am upon entry, because they took my passport to the minister. They didn't give me entry stamp. I had to wait. I almost lost my flight. I had to go back for them to stamp it before I could go. And so, yes, I have mobility, but I also, when I meet people like that, I can then feel much more difficulties they go through when they are not like me, because I go through it, but I think yes, it will even be worse because they don't have what it takes to go. But some of the things we have also encountered on the field is people asking us to help them to travel. And so particularly in this community, it was very difficult for me. And I was wondering, what can I do beyond the research in terms of education, in terms of even helping them, those who want to some sort of humanitarian job, helping them to maybe go to school, maybe get better jobs and all that, because it's a deprived community. People are struggling, and these are their intentions. They wake up in the morning, and they call something the base. I had to move from one base to the other. I mean, the base is where they meet, they sit to discuss, and these are where they discuss all the migration issues. And so I tell them, you spend all your day here discussing which route is available. They said yes. And so, yes, the positionality was there, but it's a mixed feeling. It's not all that sailing through. There are some positive, just that compared to them, I'm better. But, well, we try to manage the difficulties. Thank you.
Yeah. So complex, Mary. Thank you. We've got two questions in the chat, and Francis is patiently waiting with his hand up. I suggest we collect these questions because we're approaching kind of the end of our time. So I'll speak about ones in the chat and then let Francis ask his. So from Divine Asafo asks about the role of smartphones and the internet in influencing the decision to migrate or not to migrate. So particularly people showing kind of the great lives they might have abroad on their Facebook pages. So have you any findings around that? Annetta Pickett asks about the policy relevance of your research and potential implications. So the dominant narrative in the global north is to discourage migration. Is there also an emphasis in Ghana on retaining its young people, stopping them migrate? And more broadly, are there any lessons for policymakers in both global north and global south in your findings? And Francis, so that's two questions. And then Francis, would you like to ask your question? If you're still there, Francis?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Setrana, for the wonderful presentation. It's really a good learning experience. As a sociologist as well, would you consider, because I saw you doing a lot of definition of terms there from some of the things Carlin and the rest had already done, and looking at them in your own way, would you consider from the data you collected, the agency of the voluntary and people who had converted their involuntary immobility to voluntary mobility, would you consider their agency to be part of the ability now? I mean, if you were to redefine.
Thank you, Francis, for your question. Mary, do you want to answer those three, and then we'll bring it to a close?
I didn't get the first question very well, but I think it was asking about pictures posted by migrants on Facebook and how.
The role of smartphones, internet, and influencing decisions. So some people abroad are increasingly showcasing their better life in the migration destination, but others are telling about the challenges. So did you find any narrative about the internet informing migration decisions? So a little bit about the double edge of the diaspora that Tom mentioned in his comments.
Yeah, so I did ask, as I said, it's a very bulky data. So I asked them how they got the information. And one of the stories, although it's not in this one, was through the TV. And these days we are having a lot of soaps from Latin America. We're having a lot of soaps and movies all over. And so all these are ways by which, one of the courses I teach, social change and migration, I look at how migration has influenced our funeral, the performance of our funerals in Ghana, even marriages. So people dress like Indians, people dress like all kinds of people dress funerals. So for instance, in funeral posters, the obituary, what you find is people want to showcase their families in UK, their families. Sometimes even people who are not members, you can even go and plead with the other family that this person of yours, can we put him or her on the poster of this person who is dead in our family? So coming back to the question of all those posters and all, yes, indeed, we found out that they do have influence on people's decisions. And even there's also another study I did on COVID among youth, COVID migration decisions among the youth. And most of them got their information through the different platforms of media, WhatsApp, the Twitter and all that. And then coming back to the policy relevance, thank you very much. The policy relevance are many and many, many. And so I did even ask them, one of the questions I asked maybe to be in another paper is, what do you think can be done? And then the anger with which people talk about their governments, because I spoke to Nigerians also, Nigerians who had come to Ghana with the aim of transiting to elsewhere, but Ghana is a transit place for them. And so, yes, we need to do more in terms of creating jobs for our young people. But I said the creating job is not enough, because these things are deep seated. So you find somebody who has nurtured this over time. But what we are doing from the policy angle and also from the work I've been doing with governments is that now we are trying to have migration policies with action plans, where the government has to state that this is the objective. We want to reduce migration. We want to reduce the challenges of migration. Yes, migration has benefits. We want to enjoy the benefits, but we want to reduce the challenges associated with migration, because when people go through regular means, that is when we get the benefit out of it. And so on the policy angle, we are encouraging governments, when we are education, we are encouraging more education, more research work, more data collection on migrants and their contribution, that return migrants, their contribution, and the youth. But we are also more specifically trying to let governments, one, create more jobs for your people, doing different things to retain them, and also making sure that even if they are migrating, it is through regular means, not through the irregular means. And then I think one of the things governments are doing is to ensure bilateral agreements. And so labor bilateral transfers are also being done. Agreements are being made so that people can go through regular means, have the benefits of migration. Then the government also has that. Thank you. And there was the question about the dominant return. Okay, I think the lessons learned. I think that's what I've said with the policy. Or if I miss anything, please remind me. But there was also the thing about the agency and the involuntary. I think that's what one of my conclusions is that people decide to stay. So looking at the stories of Kidi, the Do, the Akos, it's not just it took a lot of effort, knowing that you were Ghanaian. Migration, I can use myself as an example. When I finished Norway and I had to come back, it was a struggle. Everybody, including my parents, were asking, what are you coming to do in Ghana? Just tell us, give us a list of the things you'll be doing before you come. So it's a lot of pressure for them to decide, I am not going to travel. So it takes agency, it takes negotiation, it takes effort for you to make that. So I think in one of my sentences, I wrote that negotiation and agency is even stronger than deciding to migrate, because that's the norm. Deciding to migrate is the norm. the other one is not the norm. And so deciding that in the midst of all, you want to stay as a young person is something you need to negotiate, and you need to have a lot of agency and willpower for it. Thank you.
So,
Sorry.
yes.
Yes, Doc. So I understand what you have said, but I said, will you consider it as an ability, I mean, by their technical definition, as a resource, because it looks like it takes much more effort to be voluntarily immobile than the norm. And so will you conceptualize that as an ability, a resource?
That's how I conceptualize. So in my one of the slides where I talk about ability, that's what I said, that I see ability is the negotiation, the agency that a person has to go through because they are saying that you move to actual migration when you have the ability. So I am saying that you also move to the other extreme end, which is the immobility, voluntary immobility, through your own initiative and your own resources, because they have jobs, they have families, they have things to take care of, and so that informs that decision. So I see that one also as ability.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for all those questions. There might be some others in the chat that we just don't have time to get to. I'm sorry. We should finish the session now, but we will pass on the questions to Mary, and she may be able to follow up with you. So thanks again to Tom for being discussant, and especially to Mary for that great presentation and the responses that you've made. I'd like to remind everyone that the next session this semester and the final event will be on the 9th of December at noon, and it's on multilingual classrooms as a social justice issue, exploring barriers and opportunities. And that talk will be given by Dr. Sabine Little, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Education and a Migration Research Group member here at the University of Sheffield, with discussant from Megan Greenwood, who's from the Schools of Sanctuary. So please do sign up for that session if you're interested. In time, we'll make available a full recording of today's seminar on the website, and do remember to follow us at Sheffield MRG. So thank you again to our speakers in form of Mary and Thomas discussant, and for your participation today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Mary. That was great. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Nice to meet you too. Thank you. Majala, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. I'm still here. I won't disappear just yet. I'll stay with you. It's very strange when you do these events online, that it's very different from a live seminar where people would stay around and chat afterwards and go for a cup of coffee. So I can stay a little bit and can debrief.
Yeah, that's fine.
I can stay for a moment, but I need to go and feed my hungry son who's at home.
Oh, okay. How is he doing? Is he fine?
He's fine. Well? He's just got a cold. He's got a red nose, a bit like Rudolph.